Awesome.
Okay, so everyone, in case you haven't realized yet, Professor Hanlon is giving us a guest lecture today on the Artemis Accords. And so basically, Professor Hanlon is the co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law in the University of Mississippi. She's also the president of the National Space Society, and she is the co-founder for All of Moonkind. And the purpose of this organization is to, I think it has something to do with like making sure that lunar landing sites are preserved for like our knowledge and heritage. So once again, Professor Hanlon, thank you so much. We are very grateful to have you here. And I guess you can start whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Good morning, good evening. Thank you so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure. I love NUS. So I'm going to talk really quickly. I hope you guys have a lot of questions. Just to give you a little bit more background, the National Space Society is a US-based organization. We're the oldest organization in the world that has focused on the settlement of space. I hate that word settlement. I'm trying to move us to, building communities in space, because settlement sounds awful. But the National Space Society has been looking at moving humans into space since the early 60s. So it's really, when you think about organizations, and I know you guys are part of SEDS and you have SGAC, but this one is really just about what we need to do to make sure we have and we can build successful human communities in space. I'm the professor of law here at the University of Mississippi. There's 4 centers in the world that offer what we call an advanced degree in air and space law. Mississippi, McGill in Montreal, Montreal, the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and the University of Nebraska, also here in the United States. Of course, we're the warmest and friendliest, so if you're at all interested in space law and policy, you've got to come to Mississippi. We're also home to the Journal of Space Law and the Journal of Drone Law and Policy. And so what I really love about what I do is I focus on space law and drone law, and they're both very cutting edge. And what you'll see is right now, the law is very, very fluid. And if you study law, you're certainly used to looking at codes and regulations, and you fast learn quickly in space law that, it's all very general principles. And so we're really, your generation is really going to have to start looking at how we take these big formative and aspirational principles and turn them into a law that we can transparently work around with each other. I'm also the co-founder of For All Moonkind, which is the only organization in the world that's focused on protecting human heritage in outer space. And so a lot of people don't realize when you think about here on Earth, we have the UNESCO World Heritage Convention and we protect things like the pyramids in Egypt. We don't have anything like that in space. There's no recognition of these landing sites, like the first human step off of onto another celestial body. There's no protection of that, and so we're working to protect that. But it's much bigger than that. And as I walk through this presentation, you'll see what we really are about is sort of creating kinship. Sounds like given the events of the world today, kinship seems like a funny word, but we do have faith in humanity and feel like reminding ourselves as much as we can that we're all in this together and that we're not different is really important for the future. So I call this a presentation about the Artemis Accords, but it's really about space law, because what the Artemis Accords are doing are attempting to fill the gaps in space law. And the gaps are huge, again, because what we have are really, space law is public international law. And that public international law that regards to space is really only made up of 4 major treaties. The Outer Space Treaty, the Liability Convention, which basically just takes the Outer Space Treaty portion of liability and turns it into more rules. Registration Convention, same thing, turning Article 8 of the treaty into of the Outer Space Treaty into sort of more rules. The Rescue and Return Agreement, doing the same for Article 5, sorry. And then the Moon Agreement is also considered one of the major space treaties, However, the Moon Agreement has only been ratified by 18 nations, and none of the major spacefaring nations have ratified it. So the United States, Russia, and China have not ratified the Moon Agreement. So while I think the Moon Agreement offers some good principles to think about, it's not really part of our law because it's not affecting the major space actors at all. So I'm going to talk about the Outer Space Treaty. So the first thing to think about with the Outer Space Treaty is that it's a treaty governing the guidelines and principles for activities of states in space. Okay, so this is not a treaty about, these are the rules of space. This is not a code of conduct. These are guidelines and principles for states. And so we really kind of consider it like the Magna Carta of space law versus, a constitution or something. The first article contains the most basic principles that we have agreed about space. And these principles are so embedded in our concept of space activities that they're considered customary international law. So even if a country has not signed the Outer Space Treaty, these particular provisions will bind them because they have been carried forward. They were expressed outside of the treaty, and the treaty just codified these understandings. So what are they? Space, the exploration and use of outer space shall be the province of all humankind. Space belongs to everybody, right? Exploration shall be free, space shall be free for exploration and use by all, and there shall be free access to all areas. That is, everybody has access to space. Everybody has equal access to space. Once in space, you can go anywhere you want, period. There are very few provisions which actually limit your ability to do anything you want in space. So go quickly through Articles 2 through 5. So remember now, I've created this framework under the Outer Space Treaty. Everybody has a right to go to space. Everybody has the right to do whatever they want in space. Okay, that is the basic premise of the Outer Space Treaty. And then we sort of step back and say, okay, of those big, huge, broad principles, what are we going to limit? Okay, so the treaty said we're going to limit your ability to claim territory.
Prof? Is she frozen?
I think she froze.
I think she froze. She froze.
Professor Hanlon?
Yeah.
Hold
Oh,
on. You were frozen for a minute.
Am I back?
Yes, now you're back.
Okay, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay, I will keep my chat up. So if I freeze again, maybe you can. Freeze. Article 2. Okay. So those broad principles, we have these limits. One is you cannot claim territory. So the interesting thing about Article 2, and lawyers really look at words, right? It says is not subject to national appropriation. So you can't claim territory. And then the first thing it says is claim sovereignty. So that seems to bind states only. So this is one of the gaps in the treaty. Does Article 2 apply to commercial entities? Does it apply to individuals, right? Can an individual claim property in space? Also, you can't claim territory, but can you extract resources and use those resources in space? And we'll see that the United States has said, we interpret Article 2 to mean that you can't claim territory, but you can extract resources and use them. Article 3 says, okay, the other limit we're going to put on you is that international law applies in space. And this is interesting, especially with respect to Article 2, because the Declaration of Human Rights, Article 17, says every individual has the right to own property. So if we bring the Declaration of Human Rights into space with us, which we do under Article 3, that seems to suggest that individuals can own property and claim territory in space. Article 4 says that space shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Actually, I need to change that. It says the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. It doesn't say space. So we have another gap. So we know we can do anything we want in space, except Article 4 says that we cannot put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in orbit or anyplace else in space. That's one of the very only hard restrictions in the Outer Space Treaty. Unfortunately, what doesn't it not say? It doesn't say you can't put conventional weapons in space, but at least we got the nuclear weapons in WMD. And then the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Again, what does that mean? Peaceful purposes obviously don't mean that you can't use space for military purposes, right? We have interpreted that internationally to mean you can have military assets, but you can't use space itself for military purposes. So for example, if we look at the situation right now, the United States is most likely monitoring the situation in Ukraine using satellites that it has set to spy on Russia, right? That is clearly a military use of space. That's clearly using a military asset in space, but it's not considered a violation of the peaceful purposes. Part of the reason for that is when the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated, there were already military satellites in space. And so it was understood when we talk about peaceful purposes, both the Soviet Union and the United States already had spy satellites up there. And so we have to interpret the treaty based on what was happening at the time. Article 5 says astronauts are envoys of all humankind and shall be rendered all possible assistance. So again, another really interesting moment in time for us to be chatting, because when we think about space station, there's 2 Russians and 2 Americans, 3 Americans up there right now, right? And what are things, how is the tension up there while we're facing all these tensions here on Earth? But in space, per the Outer Space Treaty, we should be dropping those tensions, right? And making sure that we are helping each other by virtue of the fact that we're all in space in this very harsh environment together. Article 6 is how the Outer Space Treaty reaches private enterprise. Article 6 says that states bear international responsibility for the national activities of others, of their nationals, and not just governmental agencies, but all nationals. This is a huge provision under international law. Under general international law, it said if you are, like, I'm an American and I do something, it doesn't necessarily mean that the United States is liable for my actions, right? If I go to Canada and I torch a gas station, then the United States will probably send me to Canada for justice, but the United States doesn't have to pay Canada for that gas station. If I'm in space, if I'm on the moon and I'm Michelle Hanlon and I go and I trot over to the Canadian moon base and I torch it, then the United States bears responsibility for that. So you see the difference, right? We have this incredible liability provision, this responsibility. The United States, any country is responsible for its nationals for anything they do in space, whether they are considered government agents or not. This is a picture of a tardigrade, and I do that because one of the things that we have to think about bearing that international responsibility, one of our requirements is that we're not going to harmfully contaminate space. And so through 2 or 3 years ago, an Israeli company, SpaceIL, sent a payload to the moon, and it was launched by SpaceX, so it became United States responsibility. And then a United States national put on this payload without telling anybody these tardigrades, which are known to be one of the only, or which are known to be able to exist in the vacuum of space. Okay, so they sent tardigrades to the moon. That's not a big issue because we know the moon is we call dead. It doesn't harbor life. It doesn't harbor any signs of life. But if that had gone to Mars, that could have been really damaging, because that would have harmfully contaminated Mars. And if that individual had never told anybody that they sent tardigrades to Mars, imagine showing up on Mars 30, 40 years from now and seeing tardigrades. And you'd be like, oh my goodness, this has changed our whole thought about evolution because there's tardigrades on Mars. Isn't that amazing? So you can see how important it is to make sure things like that don't happen. Article 7 is the liability. You are, just because you're in space doesn't mean you can do things with impunity. You can't damage, it's another limit. You cannot damage the objects of others. You can't just go up and say, oh, move your satellite because I want to be there, and bump them out. Article 8, if you launch an object into outer space, then you have jurisdiction and control over that object forever and ever and ever. And that's a very important concept when we think about orbital debris, right? Because if you have a defunct satellite up there and that satellite hits something else, you are liable. You can't say, oh, my satellite's is now inoperable. I don't care. I'm just going to leave it there. Finally, Article 9 has the only other restrictions on activities in space. You must implement your activities in space with due regard to the corresponding interests of other parties. And if you think you're going to harmfully interfere with another party, you don't have to not do your activity, but you have to consult with that other party in advance. So due regard is a really interesting principle. This is sort of the principle we have to understand as we move into space. This is what we're focused on because there's no definition of due regard. The only concept we have with respect to due regard is a international tribunal, international arbitration tribunal decision defining due regard pursuant to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So it's not with respect to space. The tribunal said it's a balancing test. We're going to balance the activities against each other to decide who is at fault, who hasn't shown proper due regard. As you can imagine, this concept of balancing is not providing any certainty to people who want to do activities in space. And so I call the due regard provision, the cha-ching provision for lawyers, because lawyers can argue a balancing test for decades, right? And so this is really, really problematic. We need to set up rules in space where we can have certainty about what activities we should be and can be implementing. This is the Moon Agreement that I told you it's not widely ratified. The reason for that primarily is because of the Article 11. And it's important to know what the Moon Agreement does because it helps us to understand the definitions in the Outer Space Treaty. The Moon Agreement says that it changes the characterization of space, and it zeroes in and it says the moon and its natural resources are the common heritage of humankind. So what does common heritage mean? This is where you get this concept that space is a global commons and everything has to be shared. So what you have to, again, think about as lawyers, as policymakers, as people interested in space, is that because the Moon Agreement has had to say this, that means the Outer Space Treaty says something different, right? If the Outer Space Treaty had intended for the space to be a global commons, it would have used this language. If the Outer Space Treaty had intended to make sure natural resources were common heritage of all humankind, it would have said so. The Moon Agreement was an attempt to advance the concept to make this idea of sharing this common heritage. So the United States has consistently said since the 1950s, space is not a global commons. And if you read speeches by presidents, every single president since Eisenhower has made this statement that space is not a global commons. And why is that? Not because the United States wants to take over space and all its resources and so forth. It's because we don't really know what common heritage means. It's not a well-defined term. And so until we really understand what people mean by common heritage, what people mean by global commons, it's not, we can't sort of go down that path. The US view is that we don't want to go down that path. So the US view is, in 2015, President Obama signed into law. It says, okay, we interpret Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty to say that you can take the natural resources. So here, remember, we see the Moon Agreement says natural resources are the common heritage of humankind. The US law says, no, we're not a party to the Moon Agreement. We are a party to the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty Article 2 says we cannot appropriate We cannot claim sovereignty, but we interpreted that to mean if you obtain resources from outer space, then you can consider them your property, whether you're a private entity or a national government. And why is that important? Because we can't take all the resources we need with us to exist in space successfully, right? So we're going to need to use space resources. So don't even think about space mining and asteroid mining. Think about building a habitat in space. We're not going to, we're not going to waste propellant launching bricks to space to build a house. We want to be able to use resources in space to create habitats for humans. And that's everybody, China, Russia, United States, everybody thinking about putting a community on the moon wants to use the resources on the moon to build that community. So we need to be clear about the fact that you can do that. Luxembourg and the UAE also have laws regarding the ability to own property that you extract from space. Japan is developing a law, and I believe China is as well. So it's becoming more common. April 6, 2020, the United States again reiterated space is not a global commons. And again, we confirm that if you extract the resources, you can use them. Then after that, after that executive order, the United States announced the Artemis Accords. So a lot of people say, oh, the Artemis Accords were they're bilateral, they throw multilateral negotiation out the window. It's not entirely true. There were 8 original parties to the Artemis Accords, and they had to hash out these guiding principles. I also want to point out that when we look at the difficulties of orbital debris, we have orbital debris mitigation guidelines that have been passed by the United Nations. So we have a non-binding soft law resolution that it was agreed by consensus by the United Nations to meet certain requirements to mitigate orbital debris. Those debris mitigation guidelines had their genesis in bilateral agreements created by the United States. So when you think about, oh, it's bilateral, these are efforts not to take on space by ourselves. These are efforts to nudge the international community to take these issues up. And already what we've seen with the advent of the Artemis Accords, just months later, United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space agreed to create a working group to look at space resource utilization. But the other really important thing about the Artemis Accords is that they don't change the law. They don't, they basically interpret the law and reconfirm a lot of the principles in the Outer Space Treaty. So I'll go through these slides really quickly. These are the slides that were prepared by NASA in support of them. Section 1 of the Artemis Accords, peaceful purposes. Well, you know that we have peaceful purposes in the Outer Space Treaty. And so this peaceful purposes, again, Artemis not changing the law, reaffirming Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. Transparency. This reaffirms Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty, which I didn't cover, but Article 11 says we're going to tell each other what we're doing in space. And so this concept of transparency, Section 2 of the Artemis Accords, is again just reaffirming responsibilities that already are incurred pursuant to the Outer Space Treaty. Interoperability is the first section which attempts to fill a gap, okay? And this is a very sort of practical application. If we go to space, we ought to be able to help each other. This really supports Article 5, the return and rescue concept. If there are humans in space, let's make sure our equipment fits together so that if that Russian community down the way is running out of oxygen, we can go and plug in. We don't have to put a round hole in a square peg in a round hole or anything like that, right? So this is a very important provision and an attempt to fill the gap. Emergency assistance, just reaffirming Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty. We're going to help each other when we're up there. Registration of space objects. This is Article 7 and 8 of the Outer Space Treaty. If you launch something up there, you're responsible for it. You have to register, you have to tell people where it is, and you have to take care of it, and you cannot harmfully interfere. Without proper registration, coordination to avoid harmful interference cannot take place. So one thing that the Artemis Accords did is they took that consultation. If you think you're going to harmfully interfere with another state, you have to consult with them. The Artemis Accords take that one step further and says, you shall not harmfully interfere with the activities of others. So pushing that law a little bit. Release of scientific data, reaffirming Article 1. We're going to share everything. Space is about collaboration and international cooperation. We're going to work really hard to do that. We're going to share any scientific data that we find, that we accumulate in space. Of course, protecting heritage. This is filling a huge gap. This is my bailiwick. And this is the first time ever in international law and any multilateral agreement that it has been recognized that we have history in space. Again, so this is filling the outer space at all. Space resources. This is the biggest, biggest issue that we're facing right now. The use of the space resources, and the Artemis Accords again reaffirms that the United States and any country which signs the Artemis Accords agrees that you can extract and utilize resources. That Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty does not prevent you from being able to do that. Another effort to fill the gaps is this article, Section 11, Section 9, deconfliction of activities. And so this is where the United States introduced the concept of safety zones. Although it's very, very important to think these are not keep out zones. These are what they call them information zones. So these safety zones are not, hey, I am here, don't come in. They are, hey, I am doing this in this portion of the moon. Please consult with me if you want to come close, and let's figure out how we can do that safely. Because one thing we're worried about on the moon is the plume effect. That regolith is very, very sharp. If you get too close to something, you're going to destroy it. So again, this is an attempt to fill the gaps left by the Outer Space Treaty. And the final section is the section on orbital debris, which is reaffirming the fact that we need to do better about cleaning up our orbits. And again, this is aspirational. Orbital debris is not mentioned in the Outer Space Treaty, and this is an attempt to fill the gaps. So we have 16 parties to the Artemis Accords right now. We had the 8 original, and slowly countries are starting to sign on. And again, what does that mean to sign the Artemis Accords? The Artemis Accords are not a binding treaty. They are just guidelines and principles, and it's within the framework of the Artemis Accords that bilateral agreements will be negotiated to talk about how these signatory countries can work together on the moon and support each other. I just have to talk about heritage, and why it's so important. I like to end, I think when you introduced me and you sort of said, well, I think it's about protecting heritage, and I want, why do I want to protect that boot print? I want you to look at that footprint. Is from Laetoli, Tanzania, and it's the first. It's considered the first memorial, or the first indication of when humans stood upright on 2 feet instead of 4, right? And so why is it so important that we stood up on 2 feet? Because it freed us up. It freed up our hands to do things like carry things, and to make tools, and to use those tools, and to draw, and to write, and to communicate. We don't get to the moon without any of those abilities. We don't get to the moon without one of our common ancestors in the Congo picking up a baboon bone and putting hash marks on it, and showing rudimentary understanding of mathematics. We don't get to the moon without somebody, one of our common ancestors, probably in Mesopotamia, picking up sand and realizing, oh, if I heat this up, I can make a substance that we now call glass. And we don't get to the moon without hundreds and thousands of dreamers and astronomers and scientists and engineers from all around the world contributing to our understanding of the cosmos. So, we look at that footprint in Laetoli, Tanzania, which is part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we protect it, and we honor it, and we memorialize it, because that was the first step humanity took get us to where we are today. And we have to remember that. We have to remember we all come from this footstep. So then we look at that blueprint and recognize it's not protected. And that's a travesty. Why? Because that's our first step into the cosmos. That's our first step into our exploration of space. The entire world owns and feels kinship around that footprint, and it should also around that blueprint. And again, it's that concept of kinship that's embodied in the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, which incidentally is signed by 193 nations, that we believe that that's the kinship we need to have as we continue our exploration of space. And so I always end on the sitting on the shoulders of giants, because we have to remember where we came from, and we have to remember that we are all in this together. So thank you. I did it in just 30 minutes. Stop sharing.
Thank you. That was really great. Maybe we can start like the Q&A session. I can go first, and then the rest you guys can just like ask your questions that you wrote down in the docs and stuff. So I guess like my first question is about like the due regard principle, and why, like, because you mentioned it's like very like a vaguely defined concept. So I was wondering, like, in your opinion, do you think that it was intentionally designed to be vague, to give like certain organizations or certain like spacefaring nations a lot of leeway and power to decide what they want to do?
So I think yes, first of all, it's absolutely vague. What you have to remember is that the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated during the Cold War. And why did we decide to go and sit at the table in the middle of the Cold War and hash out this treaty? Because fundamentally, what we wanted to do was make sure that we didn't take the war to space with us. You know, back in the 1960s, that was the driving principle: keep the peace in space. And so everything else that's in the Outer Space Treaty is sort of like thrown in there, right? You know, this is just that was the focus: keep the peace in space. And so the concept of due regard, you know, it's really interesting to look back at the history of the Outer Space Treaty, because on the one hand, you're like, all the gaps, you know, oh my goodness. But on the other hand, the principles that they have put in there are very strong, and we've been able to keep them. And I think they understood, because if you look at the, you know, Article 7 became the basis for the Liability Convention. Article 8 became the basis for the Registration Convention. Article 5 was the basis for the Return and Rescue Agreement. I think Article 9 was intended to be the basis for another agreement, just like you suggest. We didn't know, we had no idea exactly how much, I mean, there's no way in the 1960s they anticipated us having 8,000 satellites on orbit or thinking about putting 2 communities on the moon. So yes, intentionally vague, but also a sign of the times that, wow, it was kind of a miracle that we were able to agree on what we did.
Joanna, do you want to ask your question next or something? Like maybe.
Sure. Well, thank you, Prof Hanlon. I think, well, before we continue, I know not everyone has had the privilege of getting to know you. So maybe, you know, could you just share with all of us what keeps you so passionate about space after all these years?
Oh, you make me sound so old. No, it just,
I mean, you've been doing this a
all
long
these
time.
years, I'm still involved in space. Yeah, no. So I actually, I mean, my love of space started with Star Trek. You know, I really loved the show. I grew up overseas. I grew up not in the United States. My mother's Chinese, my dad's Polish. And so when I saw Star Trek and I was living in Hong Kong and I was living in Africa, you know, I thought that was life. You know, I was like, oh, everyone looks like me and my family. This is awesome. And it wasn't until I came back to the United States for the first time in my teenage years that I was like, oh, wow, that's really not life. But I think, so when I look at space, I just see endless possibility. And so what I like to tell people is, if you think about the world in the 1400s, how little we knew about space, right? You know, back in the 1400s, people thought the world was flat. And Christopher Columbus got on a boat and he bumped into North America. And a lot of bad stuff happened, absolutely. But a lot of good stuff happened also. You know, created the United States, which produced, McDonald's and jazz and Elvis Presley and the Apollo program. So there's no way in the 1400s that anybody giving money to Christopher Columbus was like, I know this is what's going to happen. You're going to bump into a land that's going to become this country, and we're going to have civil rights issues, and but then we're going to overcome them and so forth. We have no idea what space has to offer at all. And when I look at space, I don't see a, turning your back on Earth at all. This Earth is always going to be our home. But one thing that you have to remember is people think about space as being out there, it's not. We exist in space. We are in space. It's not out there. We're not like, here's the universe and here's Earth. And it's like our duty to explore our surrounding area, right? And I believe that there's so much out there. There's some element that we've never heard of that's going to, cure all our energy issues. There's the cure for cancer out there somewhere. Who knows what's out there? And I just believe it's our destiny. And I know that word has so many connotations, but it's silly to think that we should just be looking inwards on this earth, because the answers are out there, not necessarily in here. But above all, I also really, really believe, and this is where everyone puts on their rose-tinted glasses, okay, that we can have peace from space. We have Frank White is an author who's written about what he calls the overview effect. When you look from space back to Earth, every astronaut has come back and said, you realize it's a tiny little blue marble. You realize there's no boundaries on it, on Earth. We put those there ourselves. And so it has been suggested that you have some sort of physiological change in your brain by going to space. I don't know if that's true, but I do know, look at the situation right now. There are Russians and Americans on space station right now, okay? We are potentially at war here on Earth, but those astronauts, they've trained together, they've worked together for years. There's not a chance that they're going to be at war with each other on station, right? When we have, I really want, a lot of people say, oh, there's gonna be a competition for the moon because you have Artemis and you have the Russia-China Lunar Research Lab, right? I hope we have two communities on the moon, and I hope they're very different communities, because what's going to happen is one of those communities is going to run out of air or have an emergency, and there's going to be people down here that say, don't help them, let them be, and they're going to ignore us, and they're going to say, I'm not going to let them die. I'm going to go and save them. And I think that is where we find, once again, our kinship and our own humanity in space.
Wow, thank you, Prof Hanlon. Yeah, I had one question about a talk, but does anybody else want to go first?
You can go first.
Okay, all right. So Prof Hanlon, you were talking about in your answer to Rina's question, you were talking about how these treaties, they were laid out a long time ago, and now more and more people have the opportunity to go to space. So if the laws change, who has the right to change those laws?
You do. I mean, this is really one thing. So the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is where sort of laws about space are made, right? And so one of the biggest criticisms of the Artemis Accords is this feeling that the United States has taken that lawmaking ability and moved it over here and not into the committee. Everyone has the right to enter into their own bilateral agreements outside of the United Nations. And the United States isn't leaving the United Nations. The United States is saying, this is how we're going to push the law. And the United Nations can come back to the United States and say, you're wrong in your interpretation. We're going to do a treaty that interprets it differently. But it's funny, because I was teaching a class Tuesday, and I was doing my bit on orbital debris, right? And the fact that this is a real issue for us, and we are actually in this cycle where if we don't do something within the next probably 100 years, our orbit will be closed to us. And that's even if we don't launch anything else, right? And so my students like, well, why are we studying space law if we're not going to be able to access it? I'm like, Well, because we're going to fix it, before it becomes that bad. And unfortunately, it's incumbent on you guys to do that. So, we're people my age, we're beating the drum and trying to get people to pay attention. But you don't see people protesting outside the White House saying, clean our orbit, right? But we need that because who pays for that? The taxpayers, right? And if so when you go to a senator and say, we need to spend money on keeping our orbit, the senator's like, how is it going to help my constituents in Mississippi? And the senator's going to be like, I can't go to my constituents in Mississippi and say, I need to spend $1 billion to clean our orbit, because they don't care. And so we need to make people care. So truly, what is really amazing about space and space law and the evolution of the law is that your voice can be heard. There's not a lot of voices there right now. And so you, through SEDS, through a space law group, you have a voice. You can bring your voice into large organizations like or spaces, and you can go and be heard at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I mean, that's what's really important to remember is space is for everyone, and that includes you, and your voice is important, and it can be heard. And Singapore is a very, very powerful little nation. And I think that, you can make Singapore a really big voice in space as well.
Wow, that's so exciting. Thank you, Prof. Amadeus, did you have a question?
Yeah, but more of a personal one. Like, I was wondering if your interest in space, why did you study law instead of going into science?
So I am the classic. I wanted to be an astronaut, and I didn't do well in math, and I was in a boarding school. I wasn't able to go to school where we were living in Yugoslavia at the time, and my parents decided to send me back to the United States. And so I was. I mean, I like to look back and say I was unsupported as a girl trying to be in STEM, but no, I really just don't get calculus. So that's just the way my brain is wired. So when I realized I couldn't be an astronaut, I was like, okay, I will just put that behind me. And I became really interested in international relations. I wanted to be a spy, and then I wanted to be the first female Secretary of State. And then Madeleine Albright. I was like, okay, well, now what? So what I did was I put space behind me for 25 years and just put it in the back of my mind, and didn't think about it, and became a corporate lawyer, business law. And then actually my son started building satellites, and I got re-interested in space again through that. And so that's how it's a really great question. But yeah, I did not have, this strength to be able to do that. And so one thing that is really important to me to tell people is everything we do on Earth, we're going to need to do in space. So if you're not an engineer, even if you're not a lawyer, if you're not an engineer, if you're not a lawyer, not a scientist, if you're a chef, and you're interested in space, we need to know how to grow things in space, and then how to cook those things in a way that's palatable, right? If you are into design and fashion, we actually need to find better material for spacesuits. We need to figure out ways to make things more efficient for people in space. And so there's all sorts of things. I mean, right now we're doing a very hard push. Everybody that goes to station is a scientist. Well, we think that there ought to be a philosopher to go to station, so that we can actually think about what it means to be in space, not just do the experiments that you have in space, right? All of those things. So whatever you do, whatever is your passion, even if your passion is this and space is a part of it, or if it's space and you also do these other things, all of that can be enveloped into a passion for space.
Okay, I guess I can ask like Ryson's question for him. Or Ryson, are you able to ask now? Because I think he's traveling. Okay, I'll ask on his behalf. Okay, it's quite a mouthful. Do you think international space space regulation and customary international space law should evolve by collaboration via institutions like the UN, deciding how the law ought to be, or should it evolve by firstly observing how nations form their legislation on space and then collaborating to change the law reflecting national legislations?
So that is a complex question. And so I'm going to break it into two things, because there's international space law in terms of, regulating what we're doing right now and how we're going to do it. And then there's the concept of governance in space. What are we going to do in space? So as far as like lunar governance and Mars governance, right? I believe that those communities have to build their own laws. And so, it would be really, really silly and useless for us to say, if you go to the moon, or if you go to Mars, you have to do these 8 things, and this is going to be your code of conduct and so forth, because we have no idea what it's like to live on the moon or Mars. We have no idea what it's like to wake up in the morning and see Earth instead of the moon, right? Or if you're on Mars, to see nothing. So we have to let our communities off Earth, build from the bottom up, figure out their own governance and so forth. So that's sort of that part. But right now we are facing this opportunity, this need to fill the gaps. I believe it has to come from both ways. I think the United Nations works very, very slowly, which is fine. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space works by consensus. It's not an up and down vote. Every single nation in the COPUOS has to